April 18, 1942. 12 noon over Tokyo, Japan. Commander Minoru Genda of the Imperial Japanese Navy looked up from his desk at naval headquarters as air raid sirens began their wailing cry across the capital. His first thought was that this must be a drill. No enemy aircraft could possibly reach Tokyo, not with the Imperial Japanese Navy dominant across the Pacific. America's carriers were either sunk at Pearl Harbor or hiding thousands of miles away. Their land-based bombers lacked the range to reach Japan. Yet the sound of distant explosions immediately shattered this certainty. Running to the window, Genda witnessed a sight he had previously declared impossible. Twin-engined bombers with unmistakable American markings streaking low across Tokyo's skyline, their olive-drab paintwork gleaming in the midday sun. "It is not possible," he reportedly whispered, his face draining of color. "Their bombers cannot reach us." But they had. And in that moment, the myth of Japan's invulnerability, a belief Genda himself had helped cultivate within the Imperial High Command, collapsed. A new reality had arrived over the skies of the Emperor's sacred capital, carried on the wings of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers that the Japanese had dismissed as too large and cumbersome to launch from an aircraft carrier. No one in Tokyo that day could have imagined the extraordinary journey these bombers had undertaken, or how their appearance would forever alter the course of the Pacific War. The impossible task. In the dark weeks following Pearl Harbor, America's military leadership struggled to find any way to strike back against Japan. The humiliation of December 7, 1941, had been followed by a cascade of defeats across the Pacific. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, and the Philippines had fallen, or were falling to seemingly unstoppable Japanese forces. American morale was plummeting as newspaper headlines delivered one disaster after another. President Franklin D. Roosevelt summoned his military chiefs to the White House in January 1942 and issued a simple directive: find a way to bomb Japan. The psychological impact of such a raid, he believed, would be incalculable for both nations. But the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. The nearest American airfields were thousands of miles from Japan. No aircraft in America's arsenal could fly such distances with a bomb load and return. The Navy's aircraft carriers could approach Japan, but their small single-engine planes lacked the range and bomb capacity for a meaningful attack. It was at this moment of seeming impossibility that Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine warfare expert serving as Admiral Ernest King's Assistant Chief of Staff, made an observation that would change history. While visiting Norfolk Naval Air Station in Virginia, Lowe noticed Army bomber silhouettes painted on an aircraft carrier outline used for training. The casual observation sparked a revolutionary idea. What if Army medium bombers could be launched from an aircraft carrier? When Lowe proposed this unprecedented concept to Admiral King, the initial reaction was skepticism. Aircraft carriers had never launched twin-engine bombers. Their flight decks seemed too short for such heavy aircraft. The very idea violated fundamental assumptions about both carrier operations and bomber capabilities. Admiral King, however, recognized the potential and ordered feasibility studies. The numbers were daunting. Most Army bombers were either too large for carrier operations or lacked sufficient range. But one aircraft stood at the intersection of possibility: the North American B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a relatively new medium bomber that had entered service in 1941. With a wingspan of 67 feet and weight of 27,000 pounds when loaded, it seemed preposterously large for carrier operations. Japanese naval intelligence, which had studied American aircraft extensively, had categorically dismissed it as a land-based bomber only. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle, already famous as an aviation pioneer and speed record holder, was assigned to determine if the impossible might be possible. His initial calculations were promising, but required substantial modifications to the aircraft. "We'll need to strip everything unnecessary," Doolittle explained to skeptical bomber crews. "Reduce weight, add fuel tanks, train for minimum takeoff distance. It's never been done, but the math says it should work." When Doolittle briefed General Henry Hap Arnold on the concept, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces was blunt. "You realize, Jimmy, that if you lose all those aircraft without significant damage to the enemy, it will be considered a failed mission." Doolittle's response revealed his understanding of the raid's true purpose. "Sir, if we bomb Japan, even if all aircraft and crews are lost, it will still be a tremendous boost to American morale and a blow to Japanese confidence." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy had constructed a very different understanding of reality. Naval theorist and tactical planner Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, had assured his superiors that Japan's home islands were effectively immune from American air attack. In a January 1942 briefing to the Naval General Staff, he declared, "American carrier aircraft lack the range to strike and return. Their land-based bombers cannot reach us, and their bombers are too large to launch from carriers." This assessment was not mere hubris, but reflected conventional military wisdom of the era. No nation had ever launched a medium bomber from a carrier deck, much less sent it on a long-range combat mission. The Japanese High Command, therefore, focused their defensive preparations on protecting territories thousands of miles from the homeland, confident in what they believed were the immutable physical limitations of American aircraft. Engineering the impossible. While Japanese commanders built their strategies upon the assumption that no American bomber could reach their homeland, an extraordinary engineering and training effort was underway at Eglin Field in Florida. Throughout February 1942, 24 specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers underwent radical transformations. Each aircraft was stripped of its lower gun turret. The heavy radio equipment was removed. Even the ammo boxes for the remaining defensive guns were reduced to minimum capacity. Lieutenant Henry Miller, a Navy pilot experienced in carrier landings, arrived to train the Army aircrews in a skill set entirely foreign to them: how to take off from a carrier deck measuring just 467 feet, less than half the length these bombers normally required. "My first thought was that it couldn't be done," Miller would later recall. "The B-25 needed a 1,000-foot runway under ideal conditions. We had less than half that, with no headwind guarantee, launching from a pitching deck in open ocean." To compensate for these challenges, the aircraft received additional fuel tanks installed in every available space. The standard 1,800-gallon capacity was increased to 1,141 gallons, enough for a 2,000-mile journey if handled with utmost precision. This modification alone represented an engineering marvel, requiring complete redesign of the aircraft's balance and handling characteristics. In place of the removed defensive weapons, wooden dummy guns were installed in the tail section, painted black broomsticks designed to deter Japanese fighters from attacking from the rear. This simple deception represented the mission's fundamental character, creating the illusion of capability beyond what was actually possible. Each bomber was loaded with 4 specially modified bombs, 3 500-pound high-explosive demolition bombs, and 1 incendiary cluster. This modest payload reflected the harsh reality of the mission's extreme range requirements. Meanwhile, Navy personnel were modifying the USS Hornet, a brand-new Yorktown-class aircraft carrier that had been commissioned just months earlier. Special tie-down positions were constructed on the flight deck to secure the bombers against rough seas. Precise calculations determined how to position the bombers to maximize available deck space. The operation remained wrapped in extraordinary secrecy. The bomber crews were told only that they were training for a special mission involving carrier operations. Even as they practiced short field takeoffs down painted lines matching a carrier deck's dimensions, most believed they would be transported to a war zone and then flown off the carrier near land. On March 31, 1942, 16 selected B-25 bombers were flown to Naval Air Station Alameda in California. There, in the early morning hours of April 1st, in what some later noted was April Fool's Day, the bombers were hoisted by crane onto the USS Hornet's flight deck. The carrier immediately departed for sea with its unprecedented cargo. Only once the ship had sailed did Doolittle gather his crews to reveal their actual target: Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The men would be expected to launch from the carrier, bomb their assigned targets, and then fly onward to airfields in China. There would be no return to the Hornet. The mission was entirely one way. Captain Marc Mitscher, commanding the Hornet, addressed the Army flyers. "You Army pilots have never made a takeoff like this, and neither have my Navy pilots. It will be absolutely up to you to get your planes off. My job is to get this ship going into the wind at the proper speed." As the Hornet steamed westward across the Pacific, accompanied by the carrier Enterprise and a protective screen of cruisers and destroyers under Admiral William "Bull" Halsey's command, final preparations were made. Each crew studied photographs and maps of Japan, memorizing terrain features and target locations. Back in Japan, the Imperial High Command remained convinced of their safety. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was focused on extending Japan's defensive perimeter further into the Pacific. Internal naval documents from early April 1942 reveal no concern about a potential attack on the homeland. The concept of American bombers reaching Tokyo was considered so implausible that coastal air defenses remained minimal, with most fighter aircraft deployed to frontline service. Commander Genda's earlier assessment that American bombers were incapable of striking Japan had become doctrine. Japanese naval intelligence continued to categorize the B-25 Mitchell as strictly a land-based bomber unsuitable for carrier operations. Their technical analysis concluded its takeoff requirements made carrier launch theoretically impossible. This certainty would soon be shattered. The journey to Japan. April 13, 1942. Task Force 16, centered around the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, slipped away from Pearl Harbor and into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. On the Hornet's deck, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were lashed down against the perpetual rolling of the ocean swells. Their propellers were tied to prevent the wind from turning them. Their wings extended awkwardly over the edge of the flight deck. The plan called for a launch point approximately 400 miles from Japan. At that distance, the bombers could reach their targets and continue onward to landing fields in China with minimal fuel reserves. The mission timing was calculated to bring the aircraft over Tokyo just after noon. When most Japanese would be at lunch, air defenses would be at minimum readiness, and visibility would be optimal for bombing. Admiral Halsey's force maintained strict radio silence as it crossed the international date line and entered hostile waters. The sailors and airmen aboard understood that discovery by Japanese patrol craft or aircraft would likely result in the mission being scrubbed. The element of surprise was essential not just for success, but for survival. Captain Samuel Wilder of the cruiser Nashville later described the tension. "Every hour brought us closer to Japan, deeper into waters their navy controlled completely. The men on watch scanned the horizon constantly, knowing that a single enemy sighting could bring the combined weight of the Japanese fleet down upon us." Life aboard the Hornet took on a surreal quality during these days. Navy personnel, accustomed to watching aircraft take off and land constantly, instead navigated around the strange Army bombers occupying their flight deck. The bomber crews, all volunteers for a mission whose details remained partial even to them, made final preparations for what many privately considered a one-way journey. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy, pilot of the 6th B-25 in the lineup, wrote in his diary, "It's strange thinking these might be my last days. The Navy boys are wonderful to us, giving up their bunks, sharing their rations. They know we're headed somewhere dangerous, but they don't ask questions. There's respect in their eyes I hadn't expected." In the pre-dawn hours of April 18th, the task force was still over 600 miles from the planned launch point when disaster struck. A Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru, spotted the American ships through the misty darkness. Though quickly sunk by gunfire from the cruiser Nashville, the vessel managed to transmit a partial radio warning. Admiral Halsey and Colonel Doolittle faced an immediate crisis. Continuing to the planned launch point would likely mean encountering substantial Japanese naval forces. Launching immediately meant the bombers would reach their targets, but likely run out of fuel before reaching the Chinese airfields. After brief consultation, the decision was made: launch immediately. The task force would have to retreat at maximum speed after the bombers were airborne. The B-25s would have to manage with substantially less fuel reserve than planned. At 7:38 in the morning, the Hornet turned into the wind, its engines at full power to generate maximum speed over the flight deck. The sea was rough, with 20-foot swells causing the carrier to pitch and roll alarmingly. Rain squalls reduced visibility. These were the worst possible conditions for attempting what was already considered nearly impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's aircraft was first in line. As the bomber was untied, he advanced the throttles, holding the aircraft against the brakes as the engines screamed at full power. Navy deck crews crouched low, their hands signaling directions as the carrier plunged into an oncoming wave. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurika, the Hornet's navigator, had lived in Tokyo before the war and helped advise on the city's layout. Watching Doolittle prepare for takeoff, he later recalled, "It looked utterly impossible. That huge bomber on our pitching deck seemed like trying to fly a house off a postage stamp. Wow!" As the carrier rose on a swell, the deck launch officer dropped his flag. Doolittle released the brakes, and the heavily laden bomber began rolling forward, engines straining against their mounts. The aircraft's propellers created a deafening roar as it lumbered down the deck, seemingly too slow and too heavy to lift before running out of space. With less than 10 feet of deck remaining, Doolittle's B-25 staggered into the air, momentarily dropping toward the waves before gradually clawing upward. The impossible had been accomplished. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had declared incapable of carrier operations was airborne. Over the next hour, 15 more B-25 bombers followed, each launching successfully, despite the increasingly pitching deck. The last aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, lifted off with barely 5 feet of deck remaining. Doolittle's formation immediately descended to wave-top height, between 50 and 200 feet above the ocean, to avoid Japanese radar detection. For the next 4 hours, the 16 bombers flew in near-total radio silence, each aircraft navigating independently toward its assigned target in Japan. Back aboard the Hornet, Admiral Halsey ordered an immediate high-speed withdrawal. "Army got off okay," he signaled to Pearl Harbor in a rare breach of radio silence. "Heading home." He later commented in his memoir that watching the bombers depart, knowing they faced near impossible odds, was the most anxious moment of my life. The shock of the impossible. April 18, 1942, 11:45 in the morning. Tokyo, Japan. The first indication that something unprecedented was occurring came not from sophisticated defense systems, but from routine civilian police reports. Strange aircraft were approaching from the east, flying extremely low over fishing villages along the coast. Initial reports were dismissed as misidentifications of Japanese planes. At the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito was hosting a garden party for distinguished military officers and government officials, a demonstration of normalcy and confidence in Japan's expanding empire. The nation had experienced no enemy attack on its soil for more than 1,000 years of recorded history. In his office at Naval Headquarters, Commander Minoru Genda was reviewing plans for the next phase of naval operations in the South Pacific, when air raid sirens began sounding. His initial reaction was irritation at what he assumed was an unscheduled drill. At precisely noon, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's B-25 approached its primary target, a major industrial complex in Tokyo's Kojimachi district. Flying at medium altitude now for bombing accuracy, Doolittle gave the order to release their payload. 4 bombs fell from the lead bomber, followed moments later by explosions that shattered the midday calm. Almost simultaneously, the 15 other B-25s approached their assigned targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The Japanese air defense response was chaotic and ineffective. Fighter units scrambled too late, confused by the unprecedented nature of the attack. Anti-aircraft batteries fired wildly, their crews having received no warning or preparation. Most had assumed any air attack would come from carrier-based dive bombers or torpedo planes, not medium bombers that supposedly couldn't reach Japan. The physical damage caused by the raid was relatively modest, just shy of 50 buildings destroyed and about 200 damaged. Military casualties numbered fewer than 100, but the psychological impact was immediate and seismic. As Doolittle's bombers streaked away, flying southwest toward China at maximum speed, they left behind a nation in shock. The carefully constructed narrative of Japan's invulnerability had been shattered in just 15 minutes. Commander Genda, who rushed outside his headquarters building during the raid, stood amidst the chaos watching American bombers, the very aircraft he had declared incapable of reaching Japan, flying unmolested across Tokyo. A junior officer would later recall his expression. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. His face had a gray pallor, and his hands trembled slightly. When asked by a staff officer what aircraft had conducted the raid, Genda reportedly replied, "Impossible. Those are B-25s. They cannot fly from carriers. They cannot be here." But they were, and their presence forced an immediate, fundamental reassessment of Japanese strategic assumptions. Emperor Hirohito, whose garden party was disrupted by the air raid, demanded immediate explanations from military leadership. The Imperial Household Ministry released a statement claiming the raid had been insignificant, but the emperor privately expressed shock that American bombers had reached the capital. Within hours, the previously unknown name Doolittle was being whispered throughout Tokyo. How had American bombers reached Japan? Where had they come from? Would more attacks follow? The population, which had been told repeatedly that Japan was beyond America's reach, now looked skyward with new apprehension. At an emergency meeting of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff that evening, the implications became clear. Either American aircraft carriers had approached much closer to Japan than thought possible, or American bombers had somehow developed extraordinary range capabilities. Either possibility upended fundamental strategic calculations. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, reportedly pounded his fist on the table and declared, "This shall not happen again. We must destroy their carriers once and for all." This emotional reaction would have profound consequences. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been debating its next major operation, now committed fully to Admiral Yamamoto's plan to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle by attacking Midway Atoll. This decision, born directly from the Doolittle raid, would lead to the Battle of Midway just 6 weeks later, a catastrophic defeat that would forever alter the balance of power in the Pacific. For the moment, however, as night fell over Tokyo on April 18th, the immediate concern was the fate of the 16 American bombers that had appeared like phantoms over Japan, dropped their bombs, and vanished westward. Imperial General Headquarters issued orders to military units across occupied China. Find and destroy the American aircraft. Capture their crews. Learn how this impossible raid had been executed. Meanwhile, Doolittle and his 80 airmen were facing their own desperate battles for survival as they ran out of fuel over China, forced to bail out or crash land in darkness, storms, and hostile territory. Their mission had only begun. The aftermath of the impossible. As 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers disappeared into the western horizon, they left behind a transformed Japan. What the raid lacked in physical destruction, it delivered tenfold in psychological impact. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito summoned his military chiefs. "How did this happen?" he reportedly asked. "You assured me Japan was beyond America's reach." No satisfactory answer was forthcoming. Commander Minoru Genda, who had confidently declared American bombers incapable of reaching Japan, faced the harshest scrutiny. His previously unquestioned tactical assessments were now suspect. In a handwritten memo discovered after the war, he acknowledged, "The Americans have achieved what we declared impossible. We must reassess everything we believed about their capabilities." The Japanese public, told for months of unbroken victories across the Pacific, suddenly confronted a new reality. American bombs had fallen on the imperial capital itself. Newspaper accounts, heavily censored, described the raid as insignificant, but the population's anxiety was palpable. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo turned the attack into a rallying cry, declaring, "This outrage shall be avenged 100-fold." But privately, military planners scrambled to prevent future attacks. 4 fighter groups previously designated for frontline deployment were instead retained for homeland defense. Aircraft that would be sorely missed in the coming Battle of Midway. For the Doolittle raiders themselves, the mission was far from over. With fuel tanks nearing empty, all 16 crews faced desperate circumstances over China. 15 aircraft crashed or were abandoned as their crews parachuted into darkness. One bomber, critically low on fuel, diverted to Soviet Russia, where its crew was interned. Of the 80 airmen who launched from the Hornet, 72 initially survived. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in China. Of these, 3 were executed by firing squad after show trials. 1 died of disease in captivity. The Chinese civilians who helped the American airmen paid an even more terrible price, as Japanese forces killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese in punitive operations. When word of the raid reached America, the effect was electric. The headline of the New York Times on April 19th read, "Tokyo bombed by U.S. Army planes." President Roosevelt, asked by reporters where the aircraft had originated, smiled enigmatically and replied, "They came from our secret base at Shangri-La," referencing the fictional paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, who had parachuted into a rice paddy near Chuchao, China, initially believed the mission a failure because all aircraft were lost. When informed he would receive the Medal of Honor, he expressed surprise. Only upon returning to the United States did he fully comprehend the raid's tremendous psychological impact. Strategic consequences. Beyond the immediate shock, the Doolittle raid triggered a cascade of strategic decisions that fundamentally altered the course of the Pacific War. Most consequential was the Japanese Navy's reaction. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been advocating for an operation against Midway Atoll to draw out and destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers. Before the Doolittle raid, the Imperial General Staff remained hesitant. After American bombs fell on Tokyo, all opposition vanished. The need to eliminate the threat of further raids became the overriding priority. Toshikazu Kase, a senior diplomat in Japan's foreign ministry, later wrote, "The Doolittle raid convinced our military leadership that they must extend Japan's defensive perimeter farther eastward, neutralizing any base from which such attacks might come. This overextension proved our undoing." The rushed timeline for the Midway operation meant Japanese forces attacked without adequate preparation or intelligence. The resulting battle in early June 1942 became one of history's most decisive naval engagements. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The strategic initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to the United States. Japanese homeland defense was also transformed. Anti-aircraft installations around major cities tripled within weeks of the raid. Fighter units were recalled from forward areas to protect the home islands against attacks that wouldn't materialize again for nearly 2 years. These forces were sorely missed in the Solomon Islands campaign that began in August 1942. The B-25 Mitchell bomber, previously dismissed by Japanese intelligence as unsuitable for carrier operations, gained near-mythical status in Japanese military assessments. Naval records show that reconnaissance flights were doubled specifically to detect approaching B-25s, diverting resources from other critical needs. A captured Japanese intelligence document dated May 1942 revealed this new respect. The B-25 Mitchell bomber has demonstrated capabilities beyond our previous assessment. Its ability to launch from carriers makes every American aircraft carrier a potential base for bombing our homeland. The mathematics of defeat. The Doolittle raid represented a turning point in how both sides calculated the arithmetic of victory. Before the raid, Japanese strategy relied on a defensive perimeter that kept American forces too distant to threaten the homeland. After 16 bombers proved this assumption false, Japanese planners faced a troubling equation. Japan had conquered a vast maritime empire stretching across the Pacific, but lacked the resources to defend it all adequately. American industrial capacity was producing aircraft, ships, and weapons at rates Japan could never match. By late 1942, American factories were completing 1 B-25 Mitchell bomber every 4 hours, a production rate 8 times greater than Japan's output of comparable aircraft. Lieutenant General Hisaichi Terauchi, commanding Japanese forces in Southeast Asia, warned in a June 1942 assessment, "The Americans can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Our only hope lies in a decisive battle that breaks their will to continue." That decisive battle had been Midway, and Japan had lost catastrophically, directly because of the strategic overreach prompted by the Doolittle raid. More subtly, the raid forced Japanese military leaders to confront the vulnerability of their industrial base. Major General Haywood Hansell, who later commanded B-29 bombing operations against Japan, observed, "The Doolittle raid demonstrated to Japanese leadership that their dispersed industrial facilities, largely constructed of wood and paper, were uniquely vulnerable to incendiary attack, a lesson we would apply devastatingly in 1945. Legacy of the impossible. In the years following World War II, both American and Japanese military historians identified the Doolittle raid as a pivotal psychological moment that altered the war's trajectory far beyond its modest physical impact. The 16 modified B-25 Mitchell bombers that Japanese intelligence had declared incapable of reaching Japan had proven not just that the seemingly impossible was possible, but that innovation and audacity could overturn the most fundamental strategic calculations. When Japanese Defense Minister Shigeru Yoshida was interviewed in 1951 about the raid's impact, he stated simply, "Until those bombers appeared over Tokyo, our people believed we were winning the war easily and without threat to the homeland." After Doolittle, a seed of doubt was planted that never stopped growing. For the American military, the raid represented the birth of modern joint operations, with Army and Navy forces cooperating in unprecedented ways. The audacious carrier launch of medium bombers expanded the conceptual boundaries of aerial warfare, influencing strategic thought for generations. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, promoted to brigadier general immediately after the raid, rose to command the 8th Air Force in Europe. Until his death in 1993 at age 96, he maintained that his raiders' greatest achievement wasn't the physical damage they inflicted, but proving that the supposedly impossible could be accomplished. The B-25 Mitchell bomber itself was transformed from an untested design to a legendary aircraft. More than 9,800 were produced during the war, serving in every theater with distinction. Its versatility and ruggedness, characteristics that had made it Doolittle's choice for the Tokyo raid, made it one of the most successful medium bombers of all time. But perhaps the raid's most profound legacy was captured by a Japanese naval officer who witnessed the attack and wrote in his diary that evening, "Today, I watched American bombers over Tokyo. Our leaders said this could not happen. What else have they been wrong about?" The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had mocked as too cumbersome for carrier operations had delivered America's answer to Pearl Harbor. In doing so, it had shattered Japan's sense of invulnerability and set in motion the strategic overreach that would ultimately lead to defeat. 16 bombers, 80 men, and one audacious plan had forever changed the course of the Pacific War, not through